Welcome back to Producer's Toolbox. I'm your host, Carole Adrian, and today we are discussing research. This show is aimed at every producer and content creator out there, whether you are a filmmaker, a photographer, a painter, a writer. If you are the person spurring that project on, you're the producer. So we're going to talk about support materials today for historical research. And this show is aimed at the American Civil War. So I'm actually going to introduce our guests first. We have Sarah Weatherwax, who is the Senior Curator of Graphic Arts for the Library Company of Philadelphia, one of our country's foremost institutions for American culture from the 17th through the 19th century. And we have John Heckman, the tattooed historian. If you are on Twitter, Twitch, YouTube, you have probably seen his incredible work interviewing authors, reviewing books, taking us on tours of historical locations, and very experienced researchers, both of them, and some of the best friends a researcher could have. So today, I'm actually, because of our topic, Civil War research, I'm going to be the first guest because I have been working on a series called Civil War Medicine, a documentary series aimed at public television. And I have recently published a book about the subject called Healing a Divided Nation, How the American Civil War Revolutionized Western Medicine. And I want to talk about one avenue of research that I've used, which was extremely helpful. In my book, about 200 individuals are mentioned, and I wanted to make sure that I respected them by having their complete names, including maiden name, middle name, title, and sometimes, although I had spent several years dealing with primary source documents, there was some information that was hard to find. And where I found a wonderful resource was in their obituaries. Now, obituaries are written very close to the lifetime of the person involved and include a lot of personal information that isn't necessarily available elsewhere. And where these obituaries were found, as the internet expands, smaller historical societies in small towns have been able to digitize and put these things online. So whether it was in a medical journal, if the person was a prominent doctor, or whether it was in the local newspaper, the obituaries gave me those scraps of information that really painted a full picture of the individual involved. So I can really recommend that kind of research, which was, my research mostly came from original materials, and I tried to avoid modern access, but the obituaries from those individuals were extremely valuable and very accessible online. So I want to talk to Sarah about, now her realm includes more than 150,000 individual images at the Library Company of Philadelphia, which doesn't even include the illustrations in books. And Sarah is the person who really turned me on to why this is such an important period in communications, really, because of the advent of printing and of photography. So Sarah, I'm going to turn this over to you, and if you will talk to us a little bit about the whys and hows.
Okay, thank you, Carole. It comes probably as no surprise as someone who spends her time working in the graphic arts collection that I really like to try to promote people using graphics, not just as illustrations, to really think about them as sources of information, as primary documents. And for the Civil War period, as Carole mentioned, it really is a time where a lot of things were happening with both, printed material, meaning, lithographs, engravings, as well as photography, just sort of the technological changes that were taking place allowed a lot more images to, be created, which of course means that it's quite likely there are more left for us as researchers, historians, filmmakers now to get our hands on and to, really try to understand the time period that we're studying. And, I think it's important to, to think about visuals, whether it's with the Civil War or any other topic, is not just what's in the image itself, but to think about why was it created? Who was the intended audience for that item? Try to build out a bigger image, so to speak, of what's going on, not just the image itself. And in terms of technology for printers, right before the Civil War, there really was an explosion in the ability of them to create larger runs of things. Steam press, rather than the hand press, became the norm for lithographers. So you were able to print thousands of images. Also color. There was just an explosion of color. You no longer had to hand color each individual print. You could print in color. So, again, that just made for graphics that were a lot more appealing to people, as well as being more plentiful.
You said something to me at the time I was doing my research that just, I guess it blew it up in my mind. You said these images brought the war home to people at home.
Yeah, I really think it did. And I think at least in part that was, the proliferation of them made it more likely that people on the home front would see them, but also just, printers responded to, the people on the home front wanted to know what was going on. So, there was just opening up of the kinds of materials that were being printed. At the library company, for example, we have a really large collection of Civil War pictorial envelopes. We have, I think, about 6,500. And those were ones that were meant to, yes, you would put something in it and mail it, but then they became so decorative that they almost, were more, collectibles rather than pieces of mail. But also printers were creating, patriotic sheet music covers. We have Civil War paper dolls that are dressed in, specific regimental uniforms. Battlefield prints, prints of hospitals. I mean, there's so much material that was being created that it was sort of interesting. There was one, I came across a Philadelphia printer. He was a lithographer named Peter Duval. In a letter, he expressed he was concerned because so many of the artists and printers had gone off to the war, that, he wrote that in a letter that business was uncertain because he just wasn't sure, I guess, that he could get the workforce that he needed. But, the counter sort of balance to that was there was so much opportunity for all these kind of new, if not new forms of things that were being printed, but just a whole new reason to print things for an audience who wanted to know what was happening to their loved ones who were off fighting.
One of the things that really caught my attention that you introduced me to in full color were all these souvenir things that were printed. And my absolute favorite were the pies. Mm-hmm. And so it's a circular image. And I think we have some we can show, but brilliantly colored, extremely patriotic. And it's interesting how many types, just like the envelopes, all these printed patriotic items, besides the hard information, that created a mood that really laid the groundwork for a lot of what we associate with the Civil War. Just like when you hear certain music, certain banjo and things, and you think, oh, Civil War. These images really are some quintessential visuals from the period that give it a shape and a time. So amazing stuff. Well, let's bring John in a little, because now he's got, if you're online. He has amazing digital resources, and he's done a different kind of research, which is more factual than visual, I think, in your case. And you've worked from the personal stories of soldiers. Can you tell us a little about that, please?
Sure. The personal stories of soldiers are so important to understanding conflict. It is a personal experience. And for us, it is important to kind of take a look at the macro and see the big picture, and then whittle it down to the personal to try to understand what is going on in the mindset of the soldiers at the front. People back home obviously have their opinions as well of what is going on. But for my studies, Carole, it was about the soldier on the front line and how they saw the activities going on around them. And it really meant for me to go into what's called the official records to find out what their individual units may have been doing, or a division that they were with, and then whittling it down to the primary sources that are so very important for this kind of research, which is a diary, letters, memoirs, and try to understand this picture from their perspective. We talk a lot about how some of these men have their own feelings about what they're going through, and that is obviously true for each individual soldier, but each kind of has tunnel vision. And we have to put all these tunnels together to come up with a bigger idea of what was going on in their world at that time. We can't just take one person's word for it. We have to go to multiple sources. And then, as Sarah said, we have to ask the important questions of who's the intended audience for this particular primary source document? What are they trying to come across as or say to someone in a larger sense? It's as if we may have kept a diary during lockdowns, and maybe we say certain things within those pages that we wouldn't say to other people, or maybe we leave some things out. So it's constantly a thing for me to try to understand the soldier's perspective. And really, as Dr. Peter Carmichael said in one of his books, there is no common soldier. So you can't just lump everything together and say this is the common experience. And you find that when you go into those primary sources that it's so individualistic, and it makes it very, very interesting from that standpoint. And those primary sources really come to life for you when you see it as an individual experience.
Now, when you mention the orders of record, is that the OR?
The official record?
The official records.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a very specific type of document. Am I correct?
Yes, this was made in the post-war period, obviously. But what this was a large data set brought together at the time of primary sources. They took the orders from the field that they could find. They took documents from the government and such, logistical issues and things like that. And they placed it in book form so that it is a ready-made resource of primary sources to go to and say, what was this order on this date from this person to this person? So they're called the official records of the War of the Rebellion. And they are kind of this huge expanse of books that you would find in your local library. Sometimes you definitely find them in archives that concern the 19th century. Now they have been totally digitized and are available online for many people. And that is the beauty of the 21st century world, where we can digitize some of these things and do research even in lockdowns or whatever the case may be. Geographically, we may not be able to get there. And the official records are kind of that macro idea behind what is going on at the front, what is going on behind the scenes. And then we could say, if we have a soldier from, let's say, the 126th Pennsylvania, we could find documents in the official record that pertain to that particular unit, and then take their words from a letter or from a diary and match it up with what is going on in the field from the command level. And that's very important because sometimes things don't coincide properly. Sometimes you find mistakes in dating. Sometimes you find places are misspelled and you thought they were somewhere else when actually they were in another location. So taking both of those entities together, combining both of those is very important to the research process, because you're checking those boxes and making sure that there aren't any major flaws in your own research when you're trying to back up your research question, whatever that may be.
I'm just curious, actually, if I could jump in. Have you found at the official record, was there any attempt to not include material that might not have shown the military in a good light? I mean, or is it really just a complete straightforward, even if there was a record of the commander saying charge ahead, and that ended up being the worst thing that anybody could have said to do? I'm just curious.
That's a great question, Sarah. There really isn't a lot of glossing over of things. It's seen from a tactical level for the most part. So people who study military tactics and military history can take it for what it is. Really, it is very dry. It is not the best. It's not the riveting read that we would love to read on a weekend. It's kind of like reading the encyclopedia. But that is a great question, because you do wonder, is there an intended audience for this, right? So is there a bias behind what they're saying, or are there some things that are kind of hidden off the side where, like, we shouldn't have really charged this position, do we want to put this in here? I tend to see that they just wanted all the records there, and they want it to be put out there that, hey, this did happen. This may have been a terrible idea from our standpoint to do this, but this is what actually occurred. And that is why for 130 years, 140 years, the official record is still the go-to for many people, because it still has that positivity about it, as far as it's a great resource. It's not a biased resource. And you can't really make a bias out of orders in the field. We could see the order, and then we can come up with our own conclusion about, was this good or bad? And that's the beauty of the official records. It's when we get down into the soldier level, into the private on the line, or the corporal, or the sergeant, or even the colonel commanding, where we start to see in their own writings, hey, this is a little bit of a bias, or hey, he forgot to let out the fact that you probably shouldn't have given that order at that time. And then we get into the armchair generalship that many people enjoy. But the ORs, as we call them unofficially, are fantastic resources to start research from the macro level.
When I was doing my research, and so tactics and strategies were really not within my purview, because I'm focused on medicine at the time. But there was a theme starting from the very beginning. Sarah was one of the first people to whom I went at describing what I was looking at. And I got in contact with her before my first visit. And when I got there, she had 2 huge tables laid out with materials. I thought I had died and gone to researcher's heaven. And one thing that jumped out at me from the very beginning, and I think, Sarah, it was from the sheet music that you showed me, the color printings, and then throughout years of research, the theme of love and loss, and these young soldiers with a really surprisingly intimate expectation or knowledge of the possibility of death. And so the letters to their parents, the letters to wives, the letters to children they weren't going to have are so heartbreaking. I have wept over stuff in at least 40 repositories over the years. They're just heartbreaking. And so these were people facing a very strong likelihood of death, if not, dismemberment and disfigurement. And now, John, you've done a lot of research on death and burial of Civil War soldiers. What should we look for?
That's a great question, because when we think of the American Civil War, we often think about the photos we saw in textbooks or that we see in documentaries, which are the bodies laying out. We tend to go towards the cost of war very quickly when we look at this, and it's very easy to be drawn into that. As Sarah said, this was at the forefront of technology at that time. The Crimean War was photographed, but you don't see the pictures of the dead like you will in the American Civil War 10 years later. to really understand these sorts of questions about death and burial in the American Civil War. I first obviously went to the photographs because those are the primary resources that show us locations on the field. There have been several authors who have done background on those locations and have actually basically taken GIS and showcased where these men were placed onto the field, which is an absolute resource as well for everyone. But sure, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, although photography had taken a giant leap, I mean, we're still in the relative infancy of photography, I believe, at this point. But one interesting thing I found at the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which actually has the largest collection of Civil War photographs of any institution in the country. I thought it would be Library of Congress, but it wasn't. It was AHEC. And so there are thousands of photographs, but photographs took a while to get. So there are no action shots from the Civil War. They are stills. So that is why, very clear pictures of the bodies, of the scenery, of things like that. But we don't see people in motion in those photographs. So there is an element that your imagination kind of has to fill in there. But I've used that find a grave sometimes to find a full name or something, but it's interesting that all those photographs are literally stills of the Civil War. So I think that a lot of the motion comes from the music, from the letters, from the writings, and later from the films and books and television presentations. But what were you going to say, John? I stepped on you there.
Oh, no, that's okay. I'm enjoying the conversation with this because it is something that we tend to overlook, especially when we go to, let's say, a reenactment or something like that. We don't think about the cost as much. We may talk about it, but we don't see it. And that's why I really wanted to do that kind of background research. And later on, I actually did an interpretive impression of it because I want to talk about burials and the effect it had on these men. And you see it it's very rare, but you do see it in letters. And you can go to their letters, especially those who were at, say, the Battle of Antietam or the aftermath of the Battle of Gettysburg, where we have pretty much the most photographs in one place of some of these burials in progress. Alexander Gardner did a fantastic job of photographing that area just days after the battle. And you can really get a sense of the scope of loss, and trying to piece that together with those primary sources of the men who were still there, who had to do the burial details, and what that meant to them and how that affected them, I think is still something where we haven't quite touched on as much as we probably should. But some of these men seem to really have some long-lasting effects. And when you go from the official records, where I start with, and you understand who went through that area of where this photograph is taken, and then understand who the men are from their letters or diaries that are doing the dirty business of burying the dead, you really start to bring this into a new scope and a new understanding. Because I think far too often we generalize it and we say that once the battle was over, everyone moved away and went on to something else, to the next battle or to the next town. But there's still detritus of battle left behind, and sadly sometimes that were the bodies left out. As you pointed out in your book, Carole, sometimes they were left out because there was no ambulance corps. There was nothing like that in the early part of the war, and we see that sometimes in the photographic evidence as well.
There's a document that Sarah turned me on to, and I had it photographed and scanned for my book. After Gettysburg, they solicited bids for burial. There were so many, there were 5,000 Confederates wounded and dead left on that field after the battle. And they actually solicited price bids for burying everyone who was left, I think it's kind of important to remember, the popularity of the reenactments. It really gives us a glimpse, but everybody in the reenactments gets to go home afterward. So we're looking at a situation with more than 1 million casualties and probably at least 750,000 deaths in the 4 years of the Civil War. So it's I think it's a legacy that we're meant to uphold. It's like specific to the core of our country, and when things really changed in a lot of ways. And as John said, this is where we get an ambulance corps for the first time in America. This is where we start to get trained professional nurses for the first time. We see African American doctors, most of whom are educated in Canada because they were not permitted into American medical schools. We see women coming into medicine who had never been allowed or invited into that field. So the entire American culture really does a 180 at the time of the American Civil War. Well, thank you guys so much. And we're going to put up some URLs for important places if you're doing Civil War research. There are some links here to some excellent sources that you can first address online, and some of them you may be able to go in person and experience this. And bring your tissues, because boy, it's a sad story, but it's something that led to the strength of our undivided country. So thank you very much for joining us, and I hope you'll be with us next time on Producer's Toolbox, where we're going to talk about World War I research.